there's a million people listening that are saying, well, individuals should just not be bringing their personal baggage into the room. And what I'm saying is that that is impossible because our experiences, our traumas are wrapped up in the work.
I'm Rich Frazier.
And I'm Russ Fanoff.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement.
We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector.
Let's dive in. Welcome, listeners, to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm your host, Rich Frazier. In today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the topic of organizational wellness. Now, the National Council of Nonprofits published their 2023 workforce survey results, and they outlined a workforce shortage that's taking a toll on the nonprofit staff around the country. Nearly 3/4 of nonprofits completing the survey reported job vacancies, and over half of those respondents blamed the shortage on stress and burnout. How can we expect nonprofits to go out and make the world a better place if the organizations themselves are not well? And how can we help nonprofits improve their health and increase their impact? Joining me today to help answer these questions and more are Melissa Cowley-Wolf, the founder of MCW Projects, LLC, and director of the Arts Funders Forum, and Shaun Leonardo, artist and co-director of Recess, a nonprofit in Brooklyn. Now, Melissa, you've been with us before on the program. Welcome back. Shaun, you are a newcomer to the program. Glad to have you with us. Would you please, both of you, share with us your respective journeys and how your journeys have equipped you with the insights into fostering healthy organizational culture? Melissa, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back with you, Rich, and great to be here with you, Shaun. I work at the intersection of cultural strategy and wellness as an advisor, strategist, coach, and author. This comes after spending 15 years as an institutional fundraiser for art museums, arts organizations, and universities. In 2017, I founded my own company called MCW Projects, specializing in next era philanthropic strategy, organizational wellness, which includes executive coaching for leaders and collectives who want to make an impact. Alongside of that, I'm also a registered yoga, breathwork, and meditation instructor. So I pull that all together to work with clients, firmly believing that we cannot make an impact through our nonprofit work unless we are well, grounded, present, and strategic. I have seen a lot in all of these years, and all the evidence backs up that the most impactful organizations are those that are well. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic with you all today.
Wow, love the background and perspective. Thank you, Melissa. Shaun, same question to you, and I hope that you'll share some background on Recess and your role there.
Will do, but firstly, phenomenal, Melissa. Just love that background. I arrive into this knowledge base somewhat accidentally, actually, Rich. Though I will share with you first that, yes, I am in my title, both artist and co-director of Recess, which is a arts-based nonprofit in Brooklyn. We're known for hosting durational, socially engaged practices that are informed with community involvement, with reciprocal exchange, with what we call intentional communities that partner with our artists. But my relationship to Recess actually began 8 years ago as an artist invited in to initiate what would become the arts-based diversion program, Assembly, which for those who are not familiar with that terminology, this is a program that functions as an intervention in the criminal legal system, specifically for young folks aged 18 to 26. Now, to answer your question, I have to give you a bit of my journey as artist in that space at the intersection of arts and justice. That would then lead me to directorship within the organization. And to try to put it succinctly, that work emerged out of my performance practice, in which I was utilizing a methodology that argued that there are certain types of experiences, particularly those clouded by trauma, that can't possibly be conveyed accurately through verbal speech. And that instead we need to build an attunement, a different type of language to articulate these events, these experiences through body language.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I move through this work with the young people being mandated to our space, I started to ask myself, how is it that I could become more and more aware of what was happening in the room through a trauma-informed perspective? And so I began to build up that training through a somatic philosophy, which looks at how our experiences are housed within our bodies, and therefore the ways in which our bodies express a different type of truth. And I'll keep returning to that in this conversation. And it was through that work, the types of questions, the types of knowledge and skill building that I was bringing to the space in which my role kept expanding. And then now, as of 3 years, I've been welcomed in as a co-director to ask very similar questions, but from an organizational perspective. How is it that as an artist with this particular skill set and filter, how is it that I can, through leadership, look at the organization and ask, what is happening here that is going unspoken? And much of that centers on what we're going to define today as wellness.
Okay, cool. So the focus of the conversation today is organizational wellness. And most of us are pretty familiar with the concept of individual wellness, work-life balance, dealing with stress, taking breaks, etc. Let's briefly describe for listeners what organizational wellness means and why does it matter? What are the stakes here behind organizational wellness?
I'm going to start by saying that nonprofits simply are filling a gap. They're fulfilling a need left open by the government.
Yeah.
And there's pride in that. And it's personal and it's hard. It feels personal because it is. Particularly on the leadership side and on the fundraising side, it is incredibly nuanced, very complicated, personal, relational work. And often our days and our nights are spent doing it, which leads to what you mentioned above, the work-life balance, dealing with stress, taking breaks, etc. I would say that what organizational wellness is when everyone involved feels enabled and supported to work at their best. Simply put, where fear is low and confidence is high. And not manufactured confidence, not faked confidence, but the feeling of being supported where everyone can be honest and vulnerable with each other so that they can perform at their absolute best to accomplish that mission that nonprofits are uniquely set out to do.
That's a healthy organization.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And it's very, very personal work. It's very personal work. The reason we do it is because we love it, because we see the need, because we're mission driven. Otherwise, hey, we'd all go corporate because that work is certainly, we're much better compensated on that side, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, beautifully said, Melissa. I think there's a reason why this idea of organizational wellness is maybe so confusing to folks is we're not maybe properly defining what an organization is to begin with. And ultimately, what it comes down to is an organization is a body of people that have decided to spend a certain amount of time together to make mission-aligned decisions. So any organization, any institution is made up of individuals. Individuals bring their whole experiences to the table, especially in the nonprofit sector, where ideally values-aligned work touches the personal experience of those from within the organization. So inevitably, the stressors that arise are, as Melissa said, personal and relational. And to deny that, to be avoidant around those needs, is to cripple an organization.
Can you say what you just said again, Shaun? That last segment, because it was very
my pleasure.
powerful, but I wanted to process that again, and my
Sure.
brain wasn't working fast enough.
So let's first define the term, Rich. We often utilize this word organization without truthfully looking into what an organization is, which is nothing other than a body of people that have determined they wish to spend a certain amount of time together to make mission-driven decisions.
Sure.
In the nonprofit sector, quite often, those decisions are aligned with particular values that inevitably touch the personal experiences of all of those individuals which make up the organization. So therefore, the stressors that arise, as Melissa said, are both personal and relational. And so you cannot talk about organization, resilience, confidence, wellness, without attending to the people that make it up. And to not attend to those needs, therefore, is to cripple the organization.
And for me, it kind of goes towards having the right people in the right seat on the bus. Sometimes we miss the mark when we make the hires, and that kind of leads to organizational unwellness, I think. When we make the right hires, it helps us on the road towards a well organization. But what are some of the other factors that leads into an unwell organization? How do we get to that point where we have an unwell organization?
Well, Melissa, I'd love to hear your take on this, but I think the thing that's being omitted in that equation, Rich, is that you might have wonderful, skillful, intelligent individuals at the table without the platforms, practices, and ability to exist with one another well.
Right. The infrastructure, the leadership, the empowerment, it all has to be there.
That's right. It very much revolves around this idea, as you said, like the cause, that we're passionately involved in this organizational drive because it touches some part of us that we deem necessary and important. But in the nonprofit sector, particularly in the arts sector, so many of this, the necessary work is collaborative. It requires decision-making that is shared. It requires a collective action to move the work. And so if you don't stitch the individuals together into collective, the work in and of itself starts to fail. And oftentimes, what you're going to hear from, I can guarantee you, Rich, that there's a million people listening right now that are saying, well, there just needs to be defined boundaries, and that individuals should just not be bringing their personal baggage into the room. And what I'm saying is that that is impossible in this work because our personal baggages, our experiences, our traumas are wrapped up in the work. It is what motivates us to do, quote unquote, better.
It's what brings us into this sector.
That's right. And so how do we create, and soon I want to delineate practice from policy, structure from flow. How do we create the ways of being that allows a person to more fully show up, as Melissa said, in their vulnerability, but also in their expertise, so that we're creating fewer and fewer barriers to how we work together, to how we collaborate in all of its messiness.
Before we get to the solution, can we work on identification a little bit more? So if there are organizational leaders out there, or heck, man, just folks that are working in the nonprofit sector, how do we identify an unwell organization? Melissa.
You see a lot of turnover in unwell organizations. And I go back to what I was saying earlier, which is fear is low and confidence is high. And confidence being that you have what is necessary to be able to do your job and execute your goals from a place of strength. And so when people don't feel supported in their organizations, they tend to leave and go find other organizations that they might feel better in.
Yeah.
So a well organization, you have mutual support. you're someone, let's stick with the fundraiser model, because that's a lot of where I work, and I was one. So you come in as a new fundraiser for an organization. You're coming off your old job. You raised $50 million for the organization. You're flying high. You feel like you can do it, and you get into the new job. You want to hear from your colleagues, from the president of the board, from the executive director. What do you need? What do we need to be successful at this? What needs to be put in place? And not in a resource draining way, because that's not possible. We can't add staffs of 15 people, and we don't necessarily need that. But what do we need to be successful? And how can we support you and the team through this? Mm-hmm. How can we communicate, and examples of that are communicating to the organization as a whole what fundraising is, what engagement is, and how everyone at the organization has a role to play to that. And it's fun. Getting to know your audience and your donors, the people who want to support and engage with your organization, is really fun, positive work. And to get the entire organization involved in that is going to make this fundraisers more successful at what they do. Aligning and setting very, very clear and realistic goals, not unrealistic goals, and saying, what do you need to meet these goals? So those are some examples of providing the support that is needed for organizations to be successful. And as Shaun so eloquently said, organizations are people. So to delineate between organizational and individual wellness is somewhat of a fool's errand, because we're all in there working together. And the support aspect is crucial. And I would say, a lot of organizations have a wellness day where once a month they offer free yoga in the garden, or the work from home day. And that's wonderful. That's great. That's a perk. I would say that's more of a perk than a holistic approach to wellness, which is much more about how do we lower fear and raise confidence by empowering people to be successful at their job, to providing an environment where we can be honest and truthful with each other, where there's no fear that if you don't accomplish A, B, and C within the next 60 days, that you're going to be out of here. Really, genuinely supporting each other.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
Melissa, you started this conversation by talking about how nonprofits are filling a gap. And I like to say that nonprofits are doing the thing that the for-profit and the government sectors are not. So the stakes are large here. If we have nonprofits that are unwell, then there's a lot of important work that's not getting done, right?
I mean, I think the stakes have never been higher. We are and Shaun and I speak about this, we're in a permanent change scenario. We are lurching from crisis to crisis right now. We're witnessing chaos around the globe. We have this constant flow of news and social media and information that is inundating and overwhelming our brains. And we are seeing and witnessing trauma at a level that we've never before seen. And I see the toll that this is playing on the nonprofit leaders that I work with and coach, on the staff, on the board, and on the audience. We've really all been through the ringer these last few years. And there are certain communities in this country that have never had the support that they've needed, whether in the workplace or out of the workplace, to promote wellness. And so we're really inundated with a lot of needs as a society. So the stakes have never been higher. It's never felt more pressurized. And therefore, it's more important than ever that we're able to operate from this grounded, present place where we can, as Shaun said, address the stressors that are personal and relational, so that we can operate from a place of strength to ensure that the sector is relevant, it's sustainable, and that we are able to fill these needs, which are just, kind of gaping holes in our society that the nonprofits are tasked to fill, and that nonprofit workers are compelled to fill.
Mm-hmm. So how do we shift from yoga in the garden perks to a systemic change, to a holistic approach of wellness in the workplace for nonprofits? And whose responsibility is that? What are the components to making this systemic change? John.
Well, I think this is where I come in and create a delineation between practice and policy, and the necessity of both to be thought through and instated in such a way that is felt. And I'll return to this language of felt. I'll offer some examples. We often think of the liberatory policy of an expansive definition of family leave, for example, or part-time off, really allowing for individuals to identify need when it comes to sick days. That is a policy that will allow for some freedom, some room to breathe for the individual to attend to themselves, family, community. However, that is not practice. A practice might be that there are genuine check-ins with that individual to see how they are doing. We often take for granted now that particularly in all work sectors, with the advent of Zoom and virtual meetings, we take meeting culture for granted. And so we build out an agenda, we move through actionable steps and get on with our business. And we forget that there's a life being lived by each one of these individuals that shows up on one of these squares on our screens.
Mm-hmm.
So a practice might be affirming a person first before you get to business at hand. For example, if it is a project decompression or debrief session, which is terminology we use at recess, before identifying what went well and what did not go well, simply asking, how are you doing? Or potentially instituting a practice of simply checking in with one another first.
Yeah.
Those are practices. These are practices. There's one in which I often try to flow into my routine, which is, we now have regular check-ins with staff that are progress updates and et cetera, et cetera. But every so often we try to move one of those meetings into a walk in the park.
Love that.
A very simple gesture, but it allows a person, particularly a leader, to simply breathe with an individual, breathe some fresh air and walk with an individual so that they can also be seen and felt to be a human being first, rather than someone with a task list.
I just want to make an observation in your comments on practice. I have seen and I've worked with some clients recently who are changing the HR role to directors of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which I think just speaks volumes in terms of changing practice, because it's really about values now, and it's about how do we engage our people and how do we make our people feel empowered and important in the work that they do, more than just an employee. So I'd like for us to articulate the steps and the people, the roles that are responsible then for making these changes. So how do we convince the board members? How do we convince the executive directors and the CEOs to invest in wellness? What are their specific roles and jobs? How do we convince the CFOs to invest in this?
Well, there's one step that precedes convincing individuals that they're stakeholders in an organizational wellness, whether it's a board member, executive leadership, staff member. The ways in which organizations often falter is that there's such a high degree of separation from all of those stakeholders that you've named, Rich. And so before you start to move into structural shifts and introductions of practice, you also have to first convince folks that they need to have a closer proximity to one another to begin with. And this is often where organizations start to fail.
Can you explain that phrase, organizational proximity?
Well, to put it simply, what has become traditional in terms of hierarchical breakdown of power is that you have board members, which, for all intents and purposes, have the most power in the nonprofit sector, but have very little idea of what's happening on the ground. And so organizational proximity, that the culture of being in exchange with one another, first as human beings, becomes the precursor to any organizational shift toward wellness.
Melissa.
I love how Shaun talked about how hierarchy promotes or enables separation. And I think that is such a big key of this is, of course, we need organized workflow. And of course, we need organizations set up where those that have a long history of experience are mentoring, guiding, and helping those who are newer to the work. So hierarchy is not necessarily something we're going to abolish tomorrow. But the fact that it does create the separation and enforces a power structure can be very harmful in the workplace because it creates a sense of fear. And I keep going back to this, and I feel like a broken record, but fear is the most paralyzing thing that we have going on, right? Fight or flight. All of this prevents us from operating at our best. We shut down. We don't work well. We're unable to be creative. We put up walls around us. We're unable to collaborate. And mostly, we're not able to listen. And as Shaun mentioned, how hierarchy creates separation, that just puts a stop to the listening process. And the listening process is crucial for this, is understanding and listening to each other. I work with organizations and we work a lot on listening to the audience. What is the audience of your organization telling you they want or they need? And then build your strategy around that. Because again, nonprofits are here to fill a gap and serve a community at the end of the day. So if we're not listening to what our audience or those we are serving want or need, how are we ever going to be able to be successful, right? And really fulfill that need, drive that mission, create and stress that our values are aligned with what our communities want. And so the listening component needs to happen inside the organizations as well. And when we start to put up walls where we are not bringing staff and board and everyone together, and there's a fear created, when the board comes in, oh my gosh, the board's coming and it's scary. No, these are the people who want to spend their time and give their treasure to the organization. They are excited about it. They are there for a reason. And we all need to come together and listen to each other so that we can be as aligned as possible and as confident as possible and feeling like we're in it together as a team.
So for the listeners, what advice can we give? Who takes charge? Who takes the reins? There's always going to be this hierarchy of board of directors, executive leadership, and staff. So who's going to take the reins and sort of say, let's go team?
Well, quite often this responsibility does fall on executive leadership. And what I would advocate for everyone that's listening is to not do so or to handle this burden yourself, to call in the necessary collaborators, to call in the care, to call in consultancy, professional development that will allow you not to attend to wellness by yourself, but instead to create the platforms that will call in all of your stakeholders to attend to it with you. We cannot do this work alone. And now in regards to practice, we have to be very aware that you're talking to two somatic practitioners, which means that there's a belief system with both of us that what happens in the room when you're negotiating difficult terms, having highly tense conversations, is that there's an aspect to each individual that is charged, and that there's energetically something happening in each of our bodies that, without being attended to, without building an attunement, is actually taking over the conversation, particularly when it's around organizational and structural shifts, these highly difficult conversations around change. We need to build an alertness to what is happening in our bodies. And so much of a somatic practice, and again, by soma, we're really talking about our nervous systems.
Okay.
Then when we're having difficult conversations, particularly around race, particularly around power, particularly around class, that our bodies get heightened and that the stressors start fueling our nervous system in such a way that, as Melissa really so thoroughly put, we start to shut down in ways. The fight, flight, freeze, fawn mechanism starts firing.
Mm-hmm.
All of those become blockages to conversation, to listening, to being together in the room in a holistically healthy way. And so much of the practice, the somatic philosophy, revolves around this idea of co-regulation. How is it that you and I, Rich, can be in the room knowingly having a difficult conversation that is challenging, in which one of us might be calling in or calling out the other individual, but say things in such a way in which we are breathing together, we are acknowledging one another, and we are being empathetic with one another, even in the most difficult tone and texture of work.
I say hell yeah to everything Shaun just said. And I'll also add and revisit something he said earlier about, some solutions and advice that we have on how to bring this into the work. We are both trained as somatic practitioners. And so the beauty of doing this not alone as an executive leader, right, is bringing in people who can help you, or train the same way that people are going to call IPM and say, we need to do a capital campaign. You guys are experts. Can you help us? Organizations calling in those practitioners who are trained to see the tensions in the body.
Yeah.
That's the training we go through. We're able to sit in a room. Some of my friends think this is very scary, that I have some special powers, but we're trained to be able to look at a body and be able to make some basic assumptions about, based on science, based on a history of work, of what that person might be feeling. And then we're trained to be able to help that individual move energy through the body so that they can come to a state of regulation. Now, just imagine if you're able to do that, as Shaun said, with all of your colleagues, that colleagues are able to individually get themselves to a calm place where they can have rational conversations. They're not overtaken with emotion. They're not overtaken with stress. That we can have a organization that is collectively regulated. How much more successful we can be with our fundraising, with our engagement, with the services we provide our community, right? I think of the classic saying, when you're on an airplane, put on your own mask first before helping others. How are nonprofits going to do the work they need to do, that they are called to do in the communities, if we ourselves are not breathing, if we ourselves are not present? We got to help ourselves before we can better help others.
Melissa, my friend, I'm just going to give you a big hell yeah also. This is fascinating stuff. I mean, how many of us have experienced this and not even known what we were going through, whether it's nerves, whether it's stress, whether it is fear? All of us go through this, and knowing that there are trained professionals out there who can help us deal with this as individuals or even as teams, that is fascinating stuff. I want to do a whole episode on this, but we don't have time to do it right now. But Shaun, Melissa, thanks for broaching the subject. It's almost time for us to go. And by the way, I don't want to gloss over this, but the huge takeaway here is don't try to do it yourself. Call in the professionals, get some help, create the platform to allow yourself and your team to approach the wellness through a systematic method. But don't try to do it yourself, because as leaders of an organization, you've got enough to deal with. You've got enough on your plate. Don't make this another stressor. Get some help with this. Yeah?
That's right.
1,000%.
Absolutely.
It's almost time for us to go. Before we go, I want to ask you, what's the one thing that you want listeners to take away from the conversation? It can be something that we've talked about or something that we haven't talked about. Shaun, you first.
I'd love to just add on to where Melissa left us off. There's a term that you'll often hear in trauma-informed practices, somatic practices, this idea of like speaking when your lid is flipped, which means that you're functioning from a place in the brain that is animal, that does not allow for rationale. And by moving through these practices of co-regulation, as Melissa started to describe, you lower your nervous system and you're able to move from a more compassionate place, one in which your thinking brain starts to work. But this is the important part that we often miss that I want to share. It's when you co-regulate with another individual or with your community, with your colleagues, that you also allow yourself and the group to collectively be more creative, more imaginative. So it's not only about moving through the work without incident, it's about imagining possibilities that you couldn't even see.
Love that. Thank you, Shaun. Melissa.
I would say that we got to recognize that the world is just crazy right now. So, of course, we carry that into our work. It's unavoidable. So let's just say it. Let's just, if you're in an organization and you're listening to this, are you recognizing that? Are you talking with your staff about that? Is that common knowledge that like, whoa, it's crazy out there? How can we implement practices to address it, to work on it, to improve it, so that we can be the most impactful at the work that we do? We spend more time on our jobs, either remotely from wherever we're working or in a building together, than we do doing anything else. So why shouldn't that be the place where we work on this? Why shouldn't that be the place where we work to ground ourselves? And then it's better for business. A grounded, present, strategic organization is going to be more impactful. And just like we always say at IPM, the importance of strategic planning for organizations, right? What does that do? That gives you a consensus-built plan to execute together from a place of strength that everyone agrees is where the organization could go. It gives you your vision that's true to your mission. It outlines the steps you need to take, and it makes everyone's life easier. But in order to accomplish that, everyone needs to feel grounded and centered. So think of this as a strategic plan for your organizational wellness. Think of this as a strategic plan to help your employees be able to accomplish what they need to accomplish from a really grounded, present place. And I would say, lastly, most importantly, don't forget to breathe.
Melissa, I love the way that you just phrased all of that. Thank you so much. Hey, we are out of time, but before we go, where can our listeners find out more about you? First, Shaun.
Very easily, ShaunLeonardo.com and recessart.org.
Super. Melissa.
Well, and I'll attach that on. Everyone here, please take a look at Shaun's work, both visual and performance. It's incredible. Didn't do himself justice on this call. Melissa Wolf, mcw-projects.com. And you can also find me, Melissa Cowley Wolf, at LinkedIn and Instagram.
Melissa, you are always everybody's favorite cheerleader. You are such a great champion for your friends. Thank you.
You're the best.
Thank you, Shaun and Melissa, for your contributions today. Thanks for a fascinating conversation. And you are right, Shaun, in our pre-interview conversation, we could go for hours on this. And I'm sorry we didn't have the time to do that. I want to thank you again for being with us. Thanks to our producer, Curtis Schmidt. And to you, our listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues, or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.